soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
D-Day is a pivotal moment in the Second World War, and as a result, it's a pivotal moment in world history.
They must be feeling sick, they must be feeling incredibly apprehensive, and of course, as those gates drop, are they going to be facing the combined fire of the defenders?
In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe.
What needs to happen is a massive Allied invasion, an invasion that needs to push its way to the heart of the Third Reich.
Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
By the summer of 1944, the fate of Europe rested on one of the most ambitious military operations ever attempted. Across the English Channel, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops waited for the order to move. Their objective was clear: to break through Hitler's Atlantic defenses, return Allied forces to mainland Europe, and begin the liberation of occupied France. But the plan was vast, dangerous, and uncertain. It required armies, navies, and air forces from several nations to work as one. At the center of it all stood one man.
General Eisenhower was a man who had started off the Second World War as a colonel. And by the time 1944 arrives, he's become the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe.
So one of the things about Eisenhower, who's in command, supreme overall command in the theater, is that he is not so much a combat officer, but a supply officer. He's a fantastic organizer, and that's how he comes to the fore. He is meticulous in the preparations for invading France.
He's an incredibly skillful, very able commander and draws an enormous amount of respect. And of course, it's going to have to be an American in charge of D-Day because it's the Americans who are supplying, the bulk of the armor and the men. Even though it's a massive combined operation with British, Canadians, troops in the British Empire, New Zealanders, Australians, you name it, but ultimately America is in charge, and Eisenhower is the man in charge of the Americans. After the US president and Churchill, he's probably, the most important person in all the Allied forces.
The thing about D-Day is it had to have a supreme level of planning. Other amphibious assaults in history had been disastrous. A particular example of that was Gallipoli in 1915, something that Winston Churchill would be directly involved in. And the British and French who landed at Gallipoli had landed with ill preparation. They hadn't got their preparation in line, they hadn't got the maps, they hadn't got the plans, they hadn't got enough men, they hadn't got enough boats. This couldn't happen again.
The Allied preparations for Operation Overlord, which was one of the code names given for D-Day, were absolutely immense. You've got to imagine that the whole of southern England is basically turned into a kind of holding area for millions of troops, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, tanks, you name it, all the way along the seaboard. You've got landing craft, naval ships. I mean, this is truly the best part of an entire country basically being turned into a huge military base. The world had never seen anything like it because this was going to be the biggest amphibious invasion ever carried out in the history of mankind.
But to understand why this invasion carried such weight, we have to return to the moment Europe fell under Nazi domination.
By early 1944, the world had been at war for, 5 years? And during that time, we'd seen the Nazi empire expand massively. But then, by about 1942, the tide begins to turn.
Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been built on us, which they and the world never forget?
This is the end of the beginning, and that's what Churchill pointed out. And I think in his memoirs he said, from this point onwards, we didn't lose a battle. Up to that point, we'd lost most of them. And I think it's a pivotal turning point.
Towards the end of 1942, we can see two things. First of all, Rommel's defeated at the Battle of El Alamein, forced to switch the other way. So effectively, the war in the desert is going to be over by the end of 1942, early 1943. And the Soviets have pushed through around Stalingrad. They knocked over Romanian and other troops that have protected the flanks of the German army, and the German Sixth Army under Paulus is stuck at Stalingrad. Hitler has not only lost an entire German army, but they've lost 1/4 of all the German army equipment, and the whole German army has been lost in that one battle.
The Allies, the British, the Americans, and so forth, they win the battles in North Africa. And of course, the Allies are landing in Italy, and a big campaign is being fought there. Hitler is now starting to be really squeezed. But what needs to happen still is a massive Allied invasion of Northern Europe, an invasion that needs to push its way all the way through to the heart of the Third Reich, and that, of course, is the Nazi capital, Berlin. Berlin has to fall. If a new front was going to be started in France, then Hitler was going to really struggle. It didn't mean that the result was a foregone conclusion. Believe you me, the Allied invasion of Europe, was a highly risky maneuver.
By late 1943, the question was no longer whether the Allies would invade France, but when and where. The decision would be shaped at one of the most important meetings of the war.
1943 sees this really crucial conference at Tehran, the capital of Iran. And that's where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all meet each other in person for the first time.
So those three men met in that location in present-day Iran, and the idea behind it was they would decide upon what was going to happen.
Now, Stalin is very impatient. He's saying to Roosevelt and Churchill, listen, I've been fighting Nazi Germany and have lost millions of men and women since 1941. And his attitude is slightly, what are you guys up to? When are you going to mount your big second front against the Nazis in Europe?
This second front, the idea of squeezing Nazi Germany. And so that would require an assault on Fortress Europe, an assault that would bring, the Western Allies to the Western Front, whilst the Eastern Allies, that is, the Soviet Union, would be attacking on the Eastern Front.
What you've got to do is invade northern France and make your way through to Germany so we can squeeze Hitler like this.
And so they decided at that point that they would plan for D-Day on the May of 1944.
With the decision made, the Allies began preparing for an operation on a scale never before seen. Every detail had to be considered: the beaches, the tides, the weather, the movement of ships and aircraft, and the vast number of men who would have to land under fire. The Allies also had to choose the point of attack. The obvious target was the Pas du Calais, the narrowest part of the channel. But the Germans knew that too. Instead, Allied partners turned their attention further west, to the beaches of Normandy.
One of the reasons why the Allies chose Normandy was because they knew that the point closest to Britain, which of course is Calais in northern France, it's only like 20 miles across the English Channel, was really heavily fortified. And the Allies had also carried out a lot of deception operations and had managed to hoodwink Hitler into believing that when the invasion came, it would take place at Calais.
So deception was really important, because what the Allies wanted to actually determine was that the Nazi Germany would not realize where they were going to land, so to keep them guessing. The simplest place to land in terms of distance traveled would have been at Calais. And so what the Allies wanted, was to deceive the Germans into thinking that that's where they were going to assault, where they were going to cross the Channel.
Now, as a result, the Germans massively fortified the whole Calais area, and they don't fortify Normandy quite so heavily. And so that's a really, really big reason why Normandy was chosen. But also Normandy has these great big open, flat beaches that, even though they're heavily defended, are relatively easy to land on. So that's another reason. And also, all that kind of seaboard along Normandy represents a really great open area where you can start unloading, an enormous amount of men and machinery, tanks, you name it. So you have 5 main landing beaches on D-Day, and they're given 5 code names. You have Utah and Omaha. They're going to be landed on by the Americans. Then you have Juno, which is going to be landed on by the Canadians. And then you have Sword and Gold, which will be landed on by the British.
One of the big innovations that they undertook for the D-Day invasion is that they didn't think they would be able to take a port right away. They're going to land on the beaches and then eventually take a port. So they need a harbor in which to land supplies and other things and further troops. So they build these big concrete caissons, these massive things that they're going to sink when they get to the beach to create a protected harbor.
In order to prepare for D-Day, the Allies mount this enormous bombing campaign of northern France. They want to take out as many facilities that are useful for the Germans as possible. So they're going to take out factories, they're going to take out bridges, they're going to take out, obviously German units if they possibly can. So, this is a way of basically giving the Germans a complete pasting before the invasion happens.
By 9:30 p.m. on June 4th, the invasion stood on the edge of launch. Across southern England, men waited beside ships, vehicles, and aircraft, knowing the order could come at any moment. Months of planning had brought the Allies to this point, and there was little room left for delay. But one final complication threatened to undo everything.
Now, it's all well and good. You've marshaled your millions of men, your hundreds of thousands of tanks and jeeps and whatever it is. You've got your landing craft ready. Everyone's got their rifle loaded. Everything is ready to go. But there's one thing that not even the mighty Eisenhower can control, and that is the weather. The weather is the one thing that the Allied commanders can't control. And on the 5th of June, it is seriously stormy. They have to delay. But obviously, they can't just sit around for ages and ages and ages because, boats are going to run out of fuel, everyone's on standby, things have got to happen. But of course, Eisenhower knows that if he launches this invasion during a storm and he loses hundreds of thousands of men to the storm, then D-Day will fail. And if D-Day fails, that's going to change the course of the war, and with it, world history. And so they have to make a decision. Are they going to go tomorrow? And it's up to this man called James Stagg, who's the chief meteorologist. And he's got an enormous decision to make, a recommendation of what he's going to do. He's got 3 separate teams all giving him 3 separate forecasts. And Stagg says to Eisenhower and Montgomery and the Allied leaders, I think there's going to be a break in the weather on the 6th of June, and I think that's the day we've got to go. And there are some other meteorologists who simply disagree with that and think it's going to be a disaster. But Stagg says to Eisenhower, I think that's when we're going to have to do it. And Eisenhower looks at him and goes, I think you're right.
We shall fight it. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the fields. We shall.
The journey to Normandy had begun. Thousands of men were now crossing the sea toward Normandy, packed into ships and landing craft, waiting for the beaches to come into view. But D-Day would not begin on the shoreline. Before the first landing craft reached France, the opening blow would come from the sky. In the darkness before dawn, Allied aircraft crossed the coast, carrying paratroopers and glider troops behind enemy lines.
The Allies had air superiority over northern France, and so the night before D-Day, they were able to drop lots of men, lots of paratroopers behind the German defences. So of course, it's one thing just to punch your way against the Atlantic Wall, but it's also quite clever to land behind it. And so you're already kind of pincering and encircling the German defenders. And of course, what it's also going to do is create tons and tons of confusion behind German lines. They don't know which way to go. Do I defend that way or do I defend that way? So actually what you're doing is really going to cause mayhem. So those landings at night before the actual amphibious invasion are a crucial part of D-Day. As well as dropping real live human beings, the Allies were also dropping dummy paratroopers to hoodwink the Germans that the invasion force was even bigger. Remember, all this is happening at night. It's all incredibly confusing for the Germans. They're sort of in the middle of the night, suddenly all these planes are flying over, paratroopers are dropping everywhere. What the hell is going on? You could imagine the confusion and, frankly, the fear felt by the German defenders. There was no end to the Allied inventiveness when it came to deception. It was also said that record players with the sounds of gunfire and tanks were dropped as well. Anything to build up a sort of oral image, if you like, of more sort of battle going on than there really was. Anything to confuse the Germans was thrown into the mix.
Just when I was expecting the light would come on for us to jump, a Sterling aircraft flew right across our path. And then we hit tremendous turbulence, and all my men were thrown to the floor. And at that moment, the green light to jump came on. I realized there's nothing I could do, so I just jumped into the darkness. And to my astonishment, eventually landed exactly where the pilots try and get us to land. This pilot to the aircraft, who was a Norwegian, who had been so encouraging to us and so exact in how he had dropped us, a couple of months later, his plane carrying in logistics to Normandy was shot down and he was killed. But that's, I'm afraid, war. So often it's the good man who goes.
When people think of D-Day, they think of those Allied landing craft going across the Channel, landing on the beaches in Normandy, ready to do battle against the German defenders. And that naval part, the amphibious part of D-Day, was called Operation Neptune.
The thing about Operation Neptune is they designed a whole series of landing craft that would allow for men and machines to divulge onto the beaches. But when it comes down to it, it's going to be you as a soldier with your boots on that beach as soon as that gate drops on one of those landing craft. So can you imagine, as you're moving across the sea, it's going to be a little bit choppy, you're going to be feeling seasick, you're going to have absolute apprehension, you're not sure what's going to happen. Are you going to be mown down on the beach? Because the design of the German defences was such that as the men get onto the beach, they would be trapped on the beach. The thing about amphibious warfare is you have to contain the soldiers that are attacking you on the beach so that you can drive them into the sea. That's always the doctrine of amphibious warfare. So these men know that they're going to be facing this. So as they're facing this, they're coming across in these relatively shallow bottom boats, these landing craft. They're going to hit the beach. They must be feeling sick. They must be feeling incredibly apprehensive. And of course, as those gates drop, are they going to be facing the combined fire of the defenders?
We knew where we were going because we had all that ammunition. So we knew that. We knew we were all going somewhere. Eventually, as we're halfway across the channel, we learned we were going to Normandy. But where Normandy was, we had no idea.
Going across the channel in one of these landing craft was a pretty tough undertaking, let alone what you had to do when you arrived at the other side. You were pitching up and down in what was still very kind of stormy, choppy waters. So all the guys in these landing craft were kind of being sick all over, the floor of the craft, into their helmets. Seawater was coming in. The whole place really stank. And because these guys are frightened, there was a survey carried out looking at about 1/5 of soldiers, lose control of their bowels when they're scared. So you've got a lot of that going on. So it's not the most pleasant sea crossing, shall we say? All those landing craft with hundreds of thousands of troops, that was also accompanied by a massive naval bombardment of the German defences. So you've got to imagine what it would have been like to have been a German soldier on, say, Omaha Beach or Sword Beach. You're sitting there, and then the first thing you know is, middle of the night, there are Allied planes flying over your head. Then you wake up in the morning, massive naval bombardment of your positions. And then at some point in the early hours of the morning, if you've survived all that, you look through your binoculars and suddenly you see the channel awash with landing craft. This is the moment. This is it. This is the big invasion.
At 5:30 a.m., the landing craft were closing in on the shoreline of occupied France. The seas were difficult. The timing had to hold. And the landing craft had to find the right beaches in the darkness. And as the coast of Normandy came into view, one thought weighed on every man heading toward it. What would be waiting for them on the other side?
Because there was this imminent threat of invasion of Northern Europe from 1943, Hitler appoints one of his top generals, that's Erwin Rommel, to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. He sees this as a really crucial job to do. If that Atlantic Wall's strong, then Hitler feels he's going to be able to sleep at night. The Atlantic Wall was this huge series of fortifications that stretched all the way from the very north of Norway all the way down to the Pyrenees with the border of Spain and France. And it was built by basically hundreds of thousands of forced and slave labourers at the instruction, at the command of the Nazis, in order to fortify occupied Europe against any Allied invasion. And the Atlantic Wall was basically just what it sounds. It was basically a huge concrete wall, thousands and thousands of miles long, complete with tons of different types of defenses. So of course you have, massive guns built into it, machine gun nests, you have tank traps, ditches,
concrete bunkers, and Rommel's asparagus, which is sharpened logs, which are meant to create damage for parachutists and gliders that come in. They've also put in a large number of mines along the whole beach fronts and in the waters approaching them. Rommel's put in something like, 3 million mines, but he thinks they actually need like 50 million mines actually do the job suitably.
This was a huge undertaking, and it was there to kind of provide security, to the Germans, to say, listen, Europe is impregnable against the British and the Americans. Any invasion is just going to run into this wall, and that's going to be the end of it. The whole thing is a complete network, an array, dizzying array of all sorts of defences. So it's not just a concrete wall, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I don't really think that you want to be a soldier coming up against it.
At 6:30 in the morning, American troops began landing at Utah and Omaha. As the ramps dropped, they were thrown into the horror of battle.
It would have been total chaos and total confusion, because you would have just had a massive flurry of bullets shooting against you, people next to you falling and dying. Just the sheer overpowering noise of machine guns blazing away. And at the same time, you're trying to trudge through sand. Very difficult for you to make any headway against the beach.
And then what happens when you reach the beach at the other end, and that ramp goes down to enable you to run off onto the beach and storm the German positions? You are met by a hail of machine gun fire, some of which is just going to cut straight into your boat and kill all of you. And then you've got to wade through the water all the time under fire from those Germans on the Atlantic Wall, and you've got to run across the beach with all your kit. You're soaking, you're still feeling sick, you're frightened, you're terrified, and all this time you're being fired upon, the guys next to you are being blown up, body parts are flying everywhere. It is absolutely horrific and it's terrifying, and frankly, for my money, I can't imagine how anybody managed to make it up to the other end of the beach. You've got to imagine what it must be like if you manage to make it out of that craft alive. You've got to wade through the water and through the kind of soggy, sandy beach with all your kit. It's really hard to run fast, and there are machine gun bullets coming at you all the time. And your friend next to you might just be blown up, body parts going everywhere. The terror of it, and the sheer violence and noise and disorientation, and that fear, and how any of them managed to make it up to the fortifications to actually then begin to engage with the Germans, frankly, is a miracle. I'm amazed it wasn't more of a slaughter than it was. If you survived, you were just bloody lucky. It was a lottery.
These landing craft are going to hit the beach. They must be feeling sick. They must be feeling incredibly apprehensive. And of course, as those gates drop, are they going to be facing the combined fire of the defenders, who would be in their emplacements, shooting at them with machine guns, with artillery, and how would they face that? So I think every single one of those men must have been incredibly apprehensive, would be fearful, would not know what they were facing, but absolutely knew that they had to get off that beach, because as soon as they land on that, they're a target. If they could get off the beach, then they would be in a position to be safe.
But as soon as the boat, and I suppose as an 18-year-old boy who, though had survived the Blitz, had never seen a dead person in his life before. And bearing in mind I was second wave, an hour and a half behind the first wave, the carnage on that beach was something to be seen. I won't even try to describe it to you, it's so horrible. And for a few seconds I come to a screeching halt, you could say. But that sticks in my mind very, very vividly.
The first thing that comes into your mind, you poor devils, all those that are in those craft, and there must be hundreds and hundreds of them. That morning of D-Day is my most vivid memory, and I will always remember that.
The Germans had to do whatever they could to hold back the Allies. And one of the weapons most feared by Allied troops was the 88mm gun that was initially an anti-aircraft gun, but was now used, on the ground against Allied tanks and also Allied soldiers. It would just rip you to pieces. So, the Germans were using any form of armament, any form of weapon they could use to try and kick the British and the Americans and the Allies out of Normandy.
What happens is, as men get out of the landing craft, they're going to face fire that is crossing, what's known as enfilade fire. So they'd be facing fire, not right at front, they would be crossing fire. And so these would be from the obstacles and defensive positions all the way along those beaches. Now, in some beaches, those were stronger than others. There were more defensive positions completed than others. And I think that explains to a certain extent why Omaha became such a bloody place to land.
Of all the landing zones, Omaha was the one that carried the greatest uncertainty. It was heavily defended, difficult to approach, and overlooked by higher ground. And within minutes, it was clear that at Omaha, almost everything that could go wrong had gone wrong.
At Omaha, the men came out of those landing craft. They came into a position of defensive position which had crossfire, had a range of different artillery pieces there, had machine guns. It meant that as the men were landing, they were pinned down on the beach, and they therefore took an immense amount of casualties. This is completely different than other beaches as well, because Omaha has high cliffs and what the Americans refer to as draws, these slot-like valleys that would lead you to freedom. So really, for the Americans landing at Omaha Beach, they had to run up this beach, they had to face this fire, and then they had to face the cliffs that they had to then try and assault. It was incredibly challenging. They didn't have the benefit of tanks, they didn't have the benefit of anything else to support them. On the other beaches, they're completely different. So Juneau, for example, a long beach with sand dunes behind it, still something that could be easily defended by the Germans, but didn't have the same sort of setup that we see at Omaha. And at Gold and Sword, we see Hobart's funnies being deployed to take out the minefields, to attack the defensive positions, and to, of course, allow the men to attack. At Utah, we see the fewest casualties there. And Utah, again, was a really big, wide beach with very difficult to defend, which meant that a large number of men were able to get ashore and to therefore get inland quite rapidly. So all of those beaches had different settings, they had different defensive positions, they had the capability of being defended by different pieces of technology, casements, machine gun posts, and all of them therefore challenged the armies as they got ashore, but it was Omaha where the biggest challenge was faced.
By 8 a.m., the invasion had become 5 separate battles. At Utah, the Americans were moving inland. At Gold, Juneau, and Sword, British and Canadian forces were fighting through the first German defenses and pushing toward their inland objectives. Above them, Allied aircraft dominated the sky. At sea, more men, more vehicles, and more supplies were still coming in. But Omaha remained the crisis point. The beach was crowded with wreckage and wounded men. The tide was rising. squeezing survivors into an ever narrower strip of sand.
They were hell on earth. You are asking, young men to run across very, very long stretches of sand, wearing all their heavy kit, while being fired upon by really well dug-in German troops in machine gun nests behind yards and meters of concrete. I can't imagine a more horrific thing to have to do, and it tells you so much about the bravery of these guys that they did it.
Some commanders offshore considered whether further landings should be redirected. But on the bluffs above the beach, small groups of American soldiers had begun breaking through. Instead of attacking straight across the beach, they began working their way around the strong points, firing into trenches, bunkers, and machine gun positions that had dominated the shoreline. On the beaches, the second and third waves were landing. With every new landing craft that reached the shore, the balance began to shift further in the Allies' favor. The first waves had opened the way. Now, the follow-up forces brought weight, numbers, and momentum. The Allies were beginning to build a foothold. But as that foothold grew, the Germans faced a decision of their own. How quickly could they respond? And could they still drive the invasion back into the sea? The German High Command was still struggling to understand the scale of what was happening. When the first Allied troops landed at Normandy, Adolf Hitler was asleep, and crucial decisions were delayed in the very hours when speed mattered most. For the commanders on the ground, the situation was confused. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West, understood the danger quickly. So did General Friedrich Dollmann, whose 7th Army was facing the invasion in Normandy. But their ability to respond was limited. The strongest armored reserves could not simply be released at once. Key panzer divisions were held under higher authority, and without Hitler's approval, the German response was slowed. At the same time, Allied deception still clouded German judgment. Many in the High Command feared that Normandy might only be the first blow, and that the main invasion would still come at the Pas de Calais. So while Allied troops fought to expand their foothold, German commanders argued, waited, and tried to read a battlefield that was changing by the hour. But it was already too late. By late afternoon, the worst fear had passed. At Omaha, where the morning had come closest to catastrophe, American troops were now moving inland. At Utah, the link-up with airborne troops was underway. On the British and Canadian beaches, beachheads were being expanded and reinforced. And by nightfall, on June 6th, the Allies had successfully established a foothold in France. They had landed tens of thousands of men across 5 beaches. They had seized key positions. They had broken through the first line of Hitler's coastal defenses. The Allies were back in France. But D-Day comes at a terrible cost. Across the beaches, fields, and villages of Normandy, thousands of men are dead, wounded, or missing.
Around 4,400 Allied troops were killed on D-Day. Now that, of course, is an enormous number. I mean, that's a whole respectable-sized town just dead just on those 5 beaches. But actually, the Allied commanders saw that as a price worth paying, and in fact, probably a lower price than they had anticipated. So even though that is a big number, in the scheme of things, it was considered what we'll today call a result.
The landings change the course of the war. They give the Allies the foothold they have spent years trying to create, a way back into occupied Europe, and a front that Germany can no longer ignore.
Make no mistake, D-Day is a very, very big nail in the coffin for the Axis war effort. Because, there is no way that Hitler can win the war now on 2 fronts. Ultimately, Hitler is now being squeezed in a massive, massive continental vice. He's got Stalin from the east, he's got the Americans and the British and other allies from the west, and that is just going to be absolutely unstoppable. And so D-Day is one half of that unstoppable force. It is a massive moment.
So the opportunities of D-Day allowed for the second front to be open, to create this vice and to deliver on victory. And that's why it's one of the most significant battles in history, because it allowed for the combined effort from that Tehran Conference to deliver victory in the Western Europe.
D-Day helped to start to distract, to prevent further reserves from being sent to the Eastern Front, started to help to speed up the wearing down of German resources so that they performed less and less well on the Eastern Front. So D-Day, regardless of how you measure, was had a huge impact on the end of the war and helped speed it up.
Those who survive actions like D-Day, those who survive wars, they know more than any of us, and only they really know how they feel lucky, how they know that they lost a friend maybe walking or charging right next to them. It's just like a terrible, terrible lottery ticket. And they must have some sort of terrible sense of guilt at times. And they've seen horrors and atrocities that, we just can't begin in civilian life to imagine. So for that, we've always got to respect them. We've always got to remember those who charged across those beaches that morning so many years ago.